Dear friends, I am back again with a new class after a couple of months. I'm sorry that for the last 2 months I could not take any class with you, but well, from now on I shall be regularly meeting my friends, my students in particular. Now I have decided to start a series of lectures which will be 4 or 5 in number on poetry and reading of poems. I shall briefly discuss today what poetry is and how to read a poem. I shall take up poems from different poets of different ages, of different countries at random and try to read them with you. Try to show in my own way how we may approach a poem, how we may try to understand the meaning of a poem. Now, what is poetry? What is poetry? Perhaps a very difficult question, and there are so many answers. St. Augustine, it is said, was once asked, "Sir, what is religion?" And he said, "If not asked, I know, but if you ask me, I know not." Meaning, what is religion I can perhaps feel and perceive, but I cannot express. In a similar way, perhaps, we will say, what is poetry? We may try to understand, we try to perceive, but it is a bit too difficult to define it. In fact, poetry has been defined in various ways by various poets and scholars, critics and teachers. But perhaps no definition is a perfect definition, especially when we come to define or try to define poetry. Now, in India, we believe that the most ancient poet of this land was Valmiki. Valmiki is called the first poet. And how he first composed poetry, there's a story about it. That he saw two birds, a he-bird and a she-bird, on a branch of a tree. And the two birds were making love to each other. And a hunter shot his arrow and killed the he-bird. The she-bird began to lament piteously. Valmiki was struck by the lamentation of the bird, and involuntarily slokas or verses came out of him. Involuntarily, it is said, he composed Ma nishado pratishthan tamagama Shashwati Shama, etc. So, sloka or verses came as if automatically. And well, emotion gives birth to poetry. Well, we may be late to believe this. Sudden surge of emotion. And that emotion creates poetry in the poet. But how far this is true, how far this is acceptable, that is a question, that is a debate. Now, Wordsworth, William Wordsworth, all of you know his definition of poetry. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Spontaneous overflow. Now, how far can it be spontaneous? The question lies there. Because poetical composition needs certain techniques, certain command on the language, the arrangement of language, the arrangement of words rather, rhythm, meter, melody, all these things are needed. So how can a poet put words to rhythm and meter spontaneously without thinking? Is that possible? See, Eliot refuted Wordsworth and he said that poetry is not emotion. It's not the turning loose of emotion. It is an escape from emotion. Because if poet is emotionally overcharged, perhaps he will be unable to compose verses. So emotion must be there. And this emotion is to be expressed in language in a controlled manner. The poet must exercise control. What is this control? Well, the technique of poetry, the art of versification. Versification is definitely an art. And that art needs certain techniques. And therefore, we cannot say that a poet composes a poem in a feat of emotion. The emotion definitely sets the poet to the domain of creation while he thinks, or certain things go on in his mind. But when the actual work of composition comes, well, he must overcome this feat of emotion, or in other words, he must go above it. The emotion is sublimated into creation. So that is how perhaps poetry is created. Now, well, lots have been said about the poet and his life, the poet and the surroundings and the influences on him and his poetical creation. So, well, what should we do? Should we try to search for the poet? Should we try to find the personality of the poet, the views of the poet in his poetical creation? Rabindranath Tagore, one of the greatest poets of India, and definitely perhaps the greatest poet of Bengal, has said, Kobire pabena kobir জীবন চরিতে, meaning you shall never get the poet in his life story. The life story of the poet, the story of the poet's life rather, cannot give you the poet. The poet is a different soul, the poet is a different personality, the poet is a different existence, the poet is a different essence. So, by consulting his biography, reading the story of his life, we cannot understand the poet. Now, what is poetry? What does poetry convey? Only the beauty of life, only the goodness of life, or what is it? Well, we may perhaps think of a line in Shakespeare's Henry V. There is some soul of goodness in things evil. There is some soul of goodness in things evil. So, what is evil or what is good? Very difficult to decipher. So, even in goodness, there may be some evil, or even in evil, there may be some goodness. And the poet perhaps tries to articulate, create, and convey everything. J.M. Singh, John Millington Singh, was an Irish playwright and poet. And while writing the preface for his volume of poetry, W.B. Yeats acknowledged the influence of Singh on him in his later poetry. Singh once said, "Before becoming sublime, poetry must learn to be brutal." So, brutality, or the so-called brutality, is also a part of life. So, poetry means something sublime. Poetry means something great. Poetry means something which is out of the world, out of this mundane existence. Well, perhaps this is not true. And, well, poetry actually is the creation of the poet's imagination. The imagination of the poet transforms everything. This process of transformation comes through the poet's imagination. And therefore, we have to pause a little and try to think what we actually mean by imagination. What is this imagination? Coleridge perhaps may come to our help. When Coleridge's concept of imagination, primary imagination and secondary imagination. By primary imagination, Coleridge suggests that it is something which is common to all human beings. It is connected with our memory, the human memory. Now, our experiences, our interactions with the world provides us with innumerable images and sounds. And these are stored up in our memory. So when we see something or hear something, immediately what we see or what we hear gets connected with the visual and the auditory images that are stored up in our mind. And immediately we know that this is the object. So this is primary imagination. I had seen a flower, and when I see this flower now, immediately the image that I experience now is connected with the image that is stored up in my memory. And I understand that this is the flower that I came across 5 years back. Or this is the sound of a cuckoo. Even when I don't see the cuckoo, I hear the sound of its music, of its song, I can understand that where a cuckoo is singing. Because the sound stirs my memory. This is primary imagination, and this is common to every human being. But secondary imagination is something which is there in poets alone. What does secondary imagination do? And Coleridge says that secondary imagination has the power to dissolve, to diffuse, and dissipate in order to recreate. To dissolve, to diffuse, and to dissipate in order to recreate. So recreation, the images are already there, and the poet can combine images, combine them, and create something new. Now, a simple line I may quote from Wordsworth: "When she I loved looked every day as fresh as a rose in June." So the image of the girl and the image of the rose in the month of June are combined to recreate something new, an image of love, an image of a beautiful maiden. So, secondary imagination is definitely used by the poets, who take up objects that are stored up in the memory, the objects of the outer world, and the poet recreates by the process, as pointed out by Coleridge, by dissolving, by diffusing by dissipating them. He recreates. So, imagination recreates. And the poet is a creator because he recreates. Now, language, rhythm, and meter. Aristotle. Once again, we have to look back to Aristotle. Aristotle, in the first chapter of his Poetics, he says that language, rhythm, and meter are perhaps three very important things connected with poetry. Meter. Now, well, even if you talk of blank verse, perhaps there is a rhythm and there is a kind of a meter. So, the rhythm is always there. Even when it is a prose poem, the rhythm is there. The melody is there. So the poets, from the antiquity to the present day, have been trying to write their poems in the same manner. They want to convey to us certain things. Maybe it may be the image of the ancient world, it may be war, it may be patriotism, it may be the suffering of the people, or it may be the contemporary world. But, well, they have to use their language and rhythm and, in a sense, meter. Well, it changes. Language changes, rhythm changes, and meter changes with time. But some form of them must be used by the poets. And so, what is poetry? The poetry is something which is presented to us in a particular form that attracts us and that entertains us and perhaps that instructs us. Some people may object to this particular point that, well, why should poetry instruct? Why should you go to poetry for instruction? The poet is not a teacher. But directly or indirectly, every form of art teaches us. Now, well, entertainment and instruction. It may sound very old-fashioned from the time of Horace. Horace said that poetry instructs and entertains. But this is the truth. Well, there is a kind of teaching in every work of art. We learn certain things. Now, well, we must not connect this learning with our classroom learning. It's different. Perhaps we learn the meaning of life, the meaning of existence. Yes, we learn. Great poetry definitely teaches us something. Something we learn from great poetry. But, well, if we are, maybe that we are not conscious. We are not conscious that we are learning anything. Because Clattenbrock will say that, well, when the question of learning comes, well, it will no longer be art. According to Clattenbrock, what is art? Art provides us an autonomous world, which is everything. And art gives us the opportunity to dissociate ourselves either from the past or from the future. In the world of art, we are in a sense only in the present world. I see a beautiful rose. I'm greatly impressed by the red rose. I feel for it. I am in the present. I am in the world of art. But the moment I think that, well, it will be wonderful, like if I can take this rose and present it to my sweetheart, I shall be stepping down from the world of art. This is, well, what Clattenbrock says. Now, well, how far that can be accepted by us is a question. That, well, this is the world of art and this is the world outside art. Well, this is the present and that is past and that is future and we are in the present. Now, how far that would be feasible for us to maintain, we do not know. But, well, as I said, that when we read a poem, we are not conscious of any learning, but we are not conscious of any teaching. We aren't conscious that, well, something is being taught to us. But automatically, every good thing teaches us something or the other. A good book, a good film, a good novel, even a good friend. So, similarly, perhaps great poetry, good poetry. Now, by goodness, well, that is also a question. What do you understand by good or bad? By goodness, well, I do not mean something which is strictly morally good, Christian goodness or moral goodness. I don't mean that. Goodness is something which gives us a good feeling. And good poetry definitely can give us good feeling. Now, this discussion on what is poetry and what is the poetic world will be unending. Now, the poetic world, the world that is created by the imagination of the poet, and this world of imagination is more true than the so-called reality, it is said. So the world of imagination, the imaginative world of poetry, and outside the imaginative world, well, the world of reality is there. All these things are often said, and, well, various poets and critics have said that. Even our Keats and our Rabindranath Tagore, in their own ways, they have said that, the imagination, the imaginative reality is the reality of the poet. And the historical reality and the imaginative reality are two different things. So all these discussions definitely will go unendingly. But perhaps we may try to address this question: what is poetry, or what is a poem, by reading poems. We may try to read poems. Now, today, well, I have taken up a poem uh, by Sappho. Now, I told you that, well, I shall be taking up poems at random, at random. Uh, well, not according to, well, the age or language or period. Well, no, not that. I shall be taking up at random. And well, I shall take up a small poem by Sappho. Now, please, Sappho. Well, I have given you the dates, well, available dates, the dates that Sappho, 630 to 630 to 570 BC. Now, well, it's not that we have much information about her life. Some information we have, and well, I think that is better. That will be better for us because, well, there are certain information, uh, but whether, well, we are not very sure about the authenticity of all the information that we have provided. Sappho and the dates of her birth and death, well, which are given to us, provided to us, well, we are not sure whether they are authentic or not. But, well, we have said that Sappho was born in Lesbos, uh, and